If stories of World War II that reveal quiet acts of humanity move you, you're in the right place. Before we begin, tap subscribe, hit the notification bell, and give this video a like so more people find true Texas history and real human stories from the war years. In the comments, tell us where you're watching from and whether you believe kindness can be policy in wartime, or if it always has to be a private choice. Snow fell like sifted ash across the Texas plains, softening the clang of hammers and the hum of diesel trucks inching toward the barbed wire at Camp Hearn. It was December 1944, and America's war factories roared night and day. But out here, behind new-built fences and under watchtowers, a different kind of war unfolded. One made of silence, uncertainty, and waiting. That gray morning, a train squealed against metal rails and came to a grinding halt beside the compound. Doors opened. Men in tattered Wehrmacht coats stepped down first, their faces gaunt, eyes hollowed by the long journey. A few women followed who belonged to no army at all. Among them was a young expectant mother whose belly pressed round beneath a coarse wool dress. She stepped carefully onto the platform, one hand braced against her ribs, the other gripping a small cloth satchel. The cold bit like a blade. Around her the other prisoners whispered, fragments of prayers, sharp curses that dissolved in steam. None dared speak loudly in English. From a distance, a young American sergeant watched and chewed the end of a pencil. 23, maybe. The kind of farm boy who grew up breaking horses, not prisoners. These weren't monsters from propaganda posters. They were exhausted. Duty was duty, though. He noted her name on a clipboard and scribbled a remark with steady care. Pregnant approx. 7 months. Beside it he wrote, Special care, medical. He didn't know yet what that would require, only that the tremor in her hands unsettled him. Inside the camp gates, wooden barracks stood at attention in long rows, tin roofs filmed with frost. Painted across the largest wall were 2 spare letters, PW, prisoner of war. Wood smoke scented the morning air, mingling with boiled coffee and the metallic tang of wire. A stenciled sign read, Compound D, Women's Section. For a beat the young woman hesitated, fear heavy as a stone. On the ship, some had warned that American camps were brutal, that women starved, that babies born behind wire would not outlive the winter. She tightened her scarf and stepped forward. By noon she had been assigned to Barrack 12B. The room smelled faintly of soap and hay. Thin mattresses lay in neat rows. A small iron stove hissed softly in the corner. 2 other women helped her settle. One, careful with her words, explained in halting English that she had once been a Red Cross clerk in Bremen. The other, older and unsentimental, rubbed the young mother's swollen feet and muttered that at least the Americans let them keep their shoes. Outside, guards patrolled with rifles slung low, boots crunching over gravel. A steady rhythm that began to sound like a lullaby. Predictable, almost reassuring. The first night passed without incident. Then came the hunger. Rations were plain, bread, beans, thin stew. But to those who had survived U-boat crossings and bombed train stations, it was a banquet. Still, the women ate sparingly, tucking away scraps for morning. When snow on the roofs thawed, water dripped through the cracks. They set metal tins to catch the slow, patient drops. Every sound felt amplified. The whistle of distant trains, the creak of wooden beams, the whispered hopes of women counting days to birth. Patterns formed. Each morning, an American guard delivered milk bottles and set them by the door without knocking. Once the young sergeant from the gate appeared with a small sack of sugar from the commissary. He pretended it was an inventory mistake. She met his eyes through the frost-glazed window and nodded, a gesture of gratitude at once defiant and unmistakably human. He flushed and walked away, boots sinking into mud. The camp's doctor, Captain Raymond Harlan, a man of tired eyes and few words, began keeping precise notes. Subject exhibits good nutrition, vitals stable. Recommend additional rations. Reports moved up the chain of command, stamped with dull military precision. Underneath the paper trail was something more radical, an acknowledgement that even an enemy mother's heartbeat counted. Not everyone agreed. One corporal sneered at what he called coddling. "They didn't spare our boys in France," he said in the mess hall. "Why should we?" Harlan's reply was even, almost gentle. "Because we're not them." The room went quiet. Later that night, the same corporal slipped a blanket through the door of Barrack 12B and walked away without a word. War had a way of rearranging loyalties in invisible, improbable ways. January brought a deeper cold. Wind crept under the boards and gnawed at ankles. A nurse, Lieutenant Helen Parks, checked on the expectant mother daily, adjusting blankets, teaching her to breathe through the sharp grip of pain. In her private journal, she wrote, "She calls the baby Frida. Says it means peace. I wish I believed peace existed anywhere." Decades later, those notes would surface in a dusty archive, ink faded, words intact, a quiet testament that compassion had found a foothold even here. Beyond the fence, Texas moved through winter without noticing. Ranch trucks rattled past the watchtowers. Men in hats tilted their heads to get a look. The newspapers barely mentioned the women in Compound D, choosing instead to track the Battle of the Bulge and Pacific Island landings. But inside those fences, a fragile civility took hold. The women sang lullabies in German. The guards pretended not to hear. Each dawn when a bugle sounded, the camp stirred not just out of obedience, but out of something softer, routine, resilience, and the faint spark of trust. One afternoon, as the young mother washed clothes in a communal trough, she heard laughter. An American soldier was teaching two male prisoners to play baseball with a broom handle. The makeshift ball arced high against a pale sky and landed near the mess hall. For a heartbeat, she forgot the fence, the war, the fear. It was just a bright day in Texas, and men were laughing again. She smiled, too quickly, and turned away, ashamed of hope. Thunder rolled across the plains that night. Rain slapped the barracks. Cramps twisted through her body like lightning. The women gathered around, whispering, fetching towels. Someone ran for the nurse. The guards hesitated outside. It wasn't their place to enter. Then the young sergeant shoved through the doorway carrying a lantern, hands shaking as he passed it to Parks. "She needs light," he said, simple as a prayer. Hours dragged. Storm winds rattled tin roofs. The air inside filled with sweat, fear, and murmured prayers in two languages. Near dawn, a cry cut through the rain, not of pain, but of life. A thin, insistent wail pierced the barrack. Parks exhaled and smiled wearily. "A girl," she said. "She's breathing." The mother lay still, tears carving clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. The sergeant stood awkwardly and stared, not sure whether to smile or salute. For the first time since the war began, something had arrived that belonged to neither side, a life that no nation could claim. Outside, the rain eased to a whisper. The American flag at the gate sagged heavy with moisture. Inside Barrack 12B, the newborn's cry echoed faintly against wood. No record would mark the moment in a newspaper. But in that fragile sound, something ancient stirred, defiant as a flame in wind, a reminder that even in captivity, humanity kept its breath. Dawn bled slowly across the horizon, turning barbed wire into silver thread. The camp smelled of oatmeal and wood smoke. For the time being, the war felt distant, reduced to radio static and rumors. In Barrack 12B, the baby slept in a wooden crate lined with a wool blanket once used by an American soldier. The mother, thinner, exhausted, alive, touched the child's cheek as if testing whether warmth could still be trusted. Her name, though few used it, was Annalise. Camp Hearn settled into a rhythm under the Geneva Convention. Meals were measured by calorie charts. Letters were censored, but still delivered. Chapel services were allowed, hymns drifting between languages. The Americans wanted to prove, to themselves as much as to the world, that they were better than what they fought. Beneath the formality, something human began to bloom. Guards discovered German mothers knit socks the same way their sisters did back home. The tenderness of a lullaby was the same in any tongue. Pity hardened into respect. Respect blurred into empathy. Annalise learned scraps of English. Milk, doctor, thank you. She moved slowly, her body still weak, but carried herself with quiet pride. The guards joked that her baby, nicknamed Texas, would grow up bilingual. On warm days she stood by the fence and watched distant silhouettes plowing the fields, soil rising like breath. Life continued whether the world noticed or not. Unease crept into the officers' mess. Lieutenant Graves, a stiff man from Georgia, warned that the camp was going soft. Leniency, he argued, encouraged defiance. Kindness diluted discipline. Captain Harlan disagreed. Discipline is fear, he said. This is something rarer. He knew there were risks. Military intelligence had begun auditing POW camps around the country, worried that mercy made bad headlines. Publicly, the government emphasized containment. Privately, it wrestled with conscience. A new batch of male prisoners arrived hardened from Europe. They saw the relative calm of Compound D and jeered. Collaborators, they taunted in German. American lovers. One man spat near Annalise's washing line. Sergeant Miller stepped between them, jaw set. "Not here," he said, voice flat as granite. The man fell back, eyes burning. The line between compassion and control was thinner than anyone liked to admit. That spring, the radio crackled with terrible news. President Roosevelt was dead. Flags fell to half-mast. Silence drifted over the camp like ash. Even the prisoners stood still during the moment of remembrance. Death respected no border. On the 4th of July, the guards set up a small celebration. A gramophone played scratchy music. The smell of grilled meat drifted across gravel. Annalise and the other women stood apart. Nurse Parks handed out tiny flags cut of colored paper. "For the children," she said. Frida gurgled and waved hers. It was a strange tableau, a German baby in a Texas POW camp, waving an American flag she couldn't possibly understand. Yet something about it felt sacred. That night, as lights winked out, Sergeant Miller wrote his daily ledger entry. No incidents. Birth rate stable. Morale high. He paused, pencil hovering. Enemy treated with dignity. He underlined it twice. Orders from Washington arrived the next morning in the unemotional language of military cables. The women were to be transferred to a processing center and repatriated as soon as possible. No mention of babies. No acknowledgement of the fragile village that had taken root behind the fence. Annalise packed her belongings. A comb, a scarf, the small blanket Frida had been wrapped in that first night. Guards began taking down birdhouses the prisoners had built out of scrap wood. The fences would soon stand empty. Whatever had been tested here, whatever small experiment in mercy, had reached its end. The crackdown began before the trucks came. A letter marked "Confidential" landed on Harlan's desk, provide an accounting of all pregnancies, births, and civilian accommodations. In the margin, red pencil cautioned, "Public. Sentiment sensitive. Minimize publicity." A truck from Fort Sam Houston rolled through the gate one night. 2 MPs stepped down, uniforms crisp, faces cool, and announced an inspection. "We'll be auditing all medical facilities," one said. "High Command wants transparency." The word fell like a blade. By dawn, the inspectors prowled the perimeter, making notes. They paused outside the women's quarters and heard the soft coo of an infant. "So it's true," one murmured. "A German child born on U.S. soil." He turned to Harlan. "You realize the implications?" The doctor didn't blink. "Yes, it means the mother survived." Tension climbed. Acts of kindness that had felt innocent, extra milk, hidden sugar, laughter over makeshift baseball, suddenly felt like contraband. Sergeant Miller kept his distance, torn between orders and the simple decency that had guided him all winter. Still, when he passed Barrack 12B and saw Frida reach for slats of sun, Annalise's faint nod caught him like a hook. He looked away, ashamed of how easily he cared. Then another woman in Compound D went into labor. Parks ran, hair unpinned, sleeves shoved high. "Blankets, hot water, and light, Sergeant." Miller hesitated, thinking of orders. Parks didn't. "Doctor's orders," she snapped. He obeyed. Hours later, another infant arrived, smaller than Frida, but breathing. When the inspectors returned, Harlan met them with calm defiance. "Another birth," he said evenly. "Mother and child stable." "You're not authorized to continue these humanitarian experiments," one officer said. "The war isn't over." Harlan lifted his chin. "Maybe not, but this part of it can be." Germany surrendered in May. Bells rang in nearby towns. Fireworks stitched the sky. Inside the wire, relief stumbled into dread. For the prisoners, victory meant exile. For the Americans, it meant reckoning. Reports, inquiries, and the question of whether compassion had been a breach or a standard. On the final Sunday before departure, the chaplain gathered everyone in the mess hall. He spoke of forgiveness and nations finding their way back. His voice caught as he read a psalm. "He maketh wars to cease unto the end of the earth." When he finished, silence held. Then Annalise began to sing. The hymn was German, but the melody familiar. One by one, voices joined. Even guards stood with heads bowed. For a moment, language dissolved. At dawn, the trucks rumbled. Parks pressed a small envelope into Annalise's hand. A birth certificate stamped official, written in English. In the corner, in her own careful hand, she had added, "Born free." As the convoy rolled away, dust twisting behind, Miller watched from the gate. Harlan stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back. "Think they'll remember us kindly?" Miller asked. The doctor didn't answer. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried, a thin, defiant sound that carried on the wind. It was enough. On the commander's desk, a telegram lay unopened. Public inquiry launched into unauthorized treatment of enemy civilians. All involved personnel subject to investigation. The war inside the fence, it seemed, was not quite over. The harbor smelled of salt, coal smoke, and rust. The April morning they gathered at Camp Kilmer in New York to sail east. 1946. Drizzle turned the sky the color of tin. Rows of uniformed men, Red Cross nurses, and German civilians formed lines that shuffled forward with quiet resignation. Annalise stood among them, Frida tucked beneath a fraying wool coat. The baby was nearly one now, round-cheeked, curious, pale hair curling at the nape. A tag on her wrist read simply, "POW dependent, repatriation." A sailor checked names and gestured toward the gangway. "Germany," he muttered, as if the word itself were exile. Annalise nodded, too tired to answer. Beyond the rope line, Nurse Parks stood farther back than regulations allowed, lifting one hand in a small, stubborn farewell. Annalise saw it, pressed her cheek to Frida's hair, and whispered something the wind took away before it reached shore. The ship shuddered and leaned into the dark Atlantic. Nights at sea were long. Women spoke in low voices about the same list of questions. Did the apartment still stand? Was the husband alive? Would anyone forgive anything? Someone asked Annalise if the Americans had been cruel. She hesitated, then said softly, "No." And that was the cruelty. Leaving a place where mercy had existed, however briefly, felt like its own wound. The woman didn't ask again. Bremerhaven's cranes creaked like old bones when they arrived under a hard, metallic sky. Smoke rose from skeleton buildings. Allied officers processed them briskly. Rations, a blanket, a slip of paper directing each woman to a resettlement camp. The officer scanning Annalise's papers frowned at the English birth certificate. "American issue?" She nodded. "The child was born there." His brows knit. "Then she's not one of us." He stamped anyway, ink bleeding in damp air. The camp near Hamburg was crowded and cold, long rows of makeshift barracks packed with widows, orphans, and returning refugees. People looked at Annalise strangely when she spoke. Her accent had been rubbed smooth by months in Texas. Word spread that her child had been born over there. Pity melted into suspicion. An old woman hissed, "Bastard of the enemy!" Annalise said nothing. Silence, she had learned, could be a weapon. She worked in the camp kitchen, peeling potatoes, stirring vats of thin soup that never seemed enough for the mouths waiting with tin bowls. Frida slept in a basket by the stove. When Allied officers visited, Annalise stood straighter and answered questions in slow English, careful and proud. Some nights, when the wind snaked through the cracks, she remembered Texas. The chirr of crickets, the scent of wet earth after rain, laughter near fences. These felt like stolen memories. She had no one to confess them to. Occasionally, letters arrived from America, brief, careful, stamped and censored. One bore Captain Harlan's name. The paper yellowed by travel. "They're closing the camp. The records are sealed. Some will say what we did was mercy. Others will call it weakness. Keep your child safe." She carries proof that humanity survived us. Annalise read it by candlelight, hands trembling. The words burned brighter than the flame. Frida began walking that spring, stubborn steps across a dusty floor. She had her mother's gray eyes and a smile that disarmed even bitter faces. Sometimes children chanted, "Enemy baby," in sing-song voices. Annalise knelt and smoothed her daughter's hair. "You are neither side," she whispered. "You are a bridge. But bridges are lonely things." When the camp dissolved, Annalise found work as a translator for the British occupation forces in Hamburg, her English shaped by captivity, useful and suspect at once. Each morning she walked past piles of brick and twisted rebar, translating ration requests and surrender reports, while Frida stayed at a nearby creche. The city groaned and rebuilt. In 1950, a notice arrived that the American birth certificate had been annulled, her daughter's nationality reclassified under West German law. The document meant nothing and everything. Annalise folded it and placed it in a tin box beside Harlan's letter. Some nights she opened the box and traced the faded signatures, as if their ink proved that somewhere, once, gentleness had been official. Years moved on. Frida grew tall, her accent difficult to place, Northern German consonants softened by vowels she'd never actually heard. Asked where she'd been born, she sometimes said, "America," and classmates laughed, assuming she was boasting. Only her mother's quiet look kept her from explaining. In winter 1963, as the Berlin Wall divided families again, Annalise knitted by the window while the radio droned about ideology and power. She thought of the other women from Camp Hearn, those who returned to rubble, those who disappeared into the grayness of rebuilding. None ever wrote memoirs. None gave interviews. Their kindness, like their captivity, became classified history. One evening, Frida found the tin box and opened it. Inside lay 2 documents and a photograph, grainy and faded. of a young nurse in an American uniform holding a baby beneath a wooden sign that read Compound D. "Who is she?" Frida asked. Annalise smiled faintly. "Someone who believed the war could end before it ended." She closed the box, fingers lingering on the latch. As age crept closer, Annalise began to write, not reports or applications, but fragments of memory. "In the land of my enemy," she wrote, "I saw gentleness more dangerous than bullets. They feared it, perhaps rightly, because mercy outlives empires." The notebook remained unfinished. When she died, Frida found it tucked beside the tin box, the pages faintly scented with smoke and salt. Decades passed before historians cracked open sealed files. Buried in boxes were medical reports, camp rosters, photographs once stamped restricted. One showed 2 infants wrapped in U.S. Army blankets, the caption reading, "PW Sector, 1945. The faces were blurred. No one could say which was Frida or how many others were born behind wire. Brief curiosity flared in the press and guttered out beneath louder wars and fresher fears. But in a forgotten archive, the paper still waits, witness in ink and compassion. If you listen closely to the static of history, you can still hear it. The faint cry of a baby inside a wooden barrack while thunder rolls over the Texas plains. Not a cry of fear, but of arrival. Proof that even in captivity, life forced its way into the world. And though the names of those who carried that fragile humanity are mostly lost, the lesson remains, carved not into textbooks, but into the quiet spaces where conscience speaks. Mercy offered to an enemy is never weakness. It is defiance of the war itself. If this story resonated, please like this video so it reaches others who care about WF2 scene history, Texas POW camps, and true accounts of humanity in wartime. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more human-centered narratives. Camp Hearn, Fort Sam Houston, Camp Kilmer, Bremerhaven, Hamburg, and beyond. And in the comments, tell us, would you have smuggled sugar and milk or kept to the letter of orders? Do you think compassion should be policy in wartime? Or is its power precisely that it's personal?